Revolutionary talk for revolutionary times. Promoting peace, liberty, and prosperity around the clock. LibertyTalk.fm.
Welcome to Living the Solution with Dr. Elena George. Today we have an important show, one which I'm looking very much forward to. As a physician, we take the Hippocratic Oath, and one of the things in there is to do no harm. And I think there's been a transition over the last 15 to 20 years since I graduated from medical school where it's not about the doctor-patient relationship. There seems to be pressure from outside, and I don't know if it's because of cost, if it's because of a change in mindset, but there seems to be another panel, a bioethics panel that's been inserted. And we've talked about it on the show before, things like comfort care, things where the government has inserted itself under the Affordable Care Act. You're getting paid to talk about end-of-life decisions and not necessarily for doing surgery or for offering health care to extend someone's life. And I don't think it's by accident. And today I wanted to have someone who understands bioethics and who is an expert at this. And I want to introduce you to Wesley J. Smith. He's a lawyer and an award-winning author. He's a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute's Center on Human Exceptionalism. He's also a consultant to the Patient Rights Council. In May 2004, he began work, or because of his work in bioethics, he was named one of the nation's premier expert thinkers in bioengineering by the National Journal. And in 2008, the Human Life Foundation named him a great defender of life for his work against assisted suicide and euthanasia. He left full-time practice of law in 1985 to pursue a career in writing and public advocacy. He's the author or co-author of 14 books, and his latest book, Culture of Death, The Age of Do Harm Medicine, is a revised and updated edition of his award-winning Culture of Death, The Assault on Medical Ethics in America. And that was about warning about the dangers of the modern bioethics movement. He was named one of the 10 outstanding books of the year and best health book of the year in 2001. He's somebody who can speak with knowledge and compassion and empathy about what's going on in our healthcare system. And so, Mr. Smith, I wanted to thank you so much for coming on. I'm looking very much forward to our conversation.
Well, thank you very much, and please call me Wesley.
Will do. So, Wesley, let's get started. I mean, I think bioethics is one of those specialties that people don't necessarily know much about. And I don't remember it being part of my training and medical school exposure when I was studying. Can you just give us a synopsis of what is it exactly?
Sure. Bioethics is a contraction for biomedical ethics. And when you really boil it down, what it really is a bunch of people with interests in philosophy giving their opinions about healthcare. I mean, it's obviously more than that, but that's really, in essence, what it is, because you don't have to have a license to be a bioethicist. A barber needs to have a license. I've never taken a bioethics course at all, and yet because I write about these issues and people seem to accept the things that I write, or at least take it seriously, many people call me a bioethicist, although I don't call one myself that term. I'm a critic of the mainstream view in bioethics. But that isn't to say that these are not important people in the sense that they are deemed by our increasing technocratic overclass, if you will, to be the, quote, experts on public health and medical ethics. Bioethics began back in the 70s or so, and it was it arose primarily because of the emergence of high-tech medicine, particularly the kidney dialysis machines, where you ended up in a circumstance where you had more patients than there were machines, and people started to see the need for determining how do we decide who gets the machine, who doesn't get the machine, what are the principles that we should apply when making these kinds of decisions and so forth. And early in the movement, you had a dichotomy, you had kind of a fight, a struggle for the heart and soul of what became bioethics. On one hand, you had a fellow named Paul Ramsey. Paul Ramsey was a Christian theologian. He brought a sanctity of life perspective into bioethics and argued, for example, his most famous book was The Patient as a Person, in which he posited that people should not have to be forced to receive medical treatment, be hooked up to tubes, and so forth when they did not want that, because to force these interventions upon them wasn't to treat them not as a person. The problem with bioethics comes from Joseph Fletcher. I'm being very simplified here, but I think it's generally true. Ramsey's great antagonist was Joseph Fletcher. Joseph Fletcher was a lapsed Episcopalian priest who became an atheist and turned to utilitarianism. And he denied the sanctity of human life. He denied that human life had intrinsic dignity simply and merely because it is human. And he came up with what he called criteria for humanhood, where you basically had to earn your value by having certain criteria, such as, let's say, being self-aware or able to communicate. And that later became called personhood theory, where many in bioethics think being human isn't what matters. What matters is if you're a person, and a person is somebody with certain capacities. And the problem became, when I did my research for the first edition of Culture of Death, that it turned out that Joseph Fletcher carried the field. Because when I was trying to I wanted to do a tit for tat in the book. Fletcher says, Ramsey says, and so forth, back and forth. Everything Fletcher wrote was still in print. Nothing that Ramsey wrote was then in print. Since then, A Patient as a Person has been reissued. But the great tragedy for bioethics, when we deal with high-tech medicine, when we're dealing with things like the COVID crisis, and when you're dealing with all of the complications of things like organ transplantation and assisted suicide and this kind of thing, abortion, etc., is that the Paul Ramsey School did not carry the day. So that today, if someone says I'm a bioethicist, or if you see somebody on television as a bioethicist, unless they have a modifier in front of their name, such as, say, Catholic or human life or pro-life or conservative, something like that, you're going to tend to find a person who does not believe in the sanctity of human life, who believes in a utilitarian-ish, if not strictly utilitarian approach, who probably supports assisted suicide, healthcare rationing, might even support infanticide, based on what's called the quality of life ethic, so that people with a higher quality of life in this view actually have greater value than people deemed to have a lower quality of life. And that's just a form of invidious discrimination. And so I hope I haven't been too complicated, but that's generally what we're talking about.
I think you were brilliant. That was actually so clear. Now I understand why the mindset has been single-mindedly towards deciding who wins and loses, who lives and who dies. And it now explains the Affordable Care Act, because one of the major architects of that is a bioethicist.
Yes, Ezekiel Emanuel. And Ezekiel Emanuel is one of the most powerful people in the technocratic class in this country. And in fact, I've been doing a lot of writing about him because he's Joe Biden's, I'm not being partisan here, but he's Joe Biden's premier healthcare advisor on things such as COVID. And Ezekiel Emanuel is perhaps most infamous for saying that he wanted to die at age 75, because when you reach age 75, your life ceases to have, the kind of purpose it had when it was younger, and that you might even be remembered as being pathetic. And if anybody wants to read that article, it's available online. It was published in The Atlantic a few years ago, and I think the title was Why I Want to Die at 75. Now, he doesn't in that article say we should make sure everybody dies at 75, but there's a great implication that the reader should want to die at 75 as well. So you can see he comes in with an anti-aged or anti-elderly perspective. In this COVID situation, when they're talking about, well, if there's a vaccination, who should get it first? My perspective, and I've written about it, is that the people who should get it first, and this has actually been the approach of the Journal of the American Medical Association is that the people who should get it first are the people most at risk. The elderly people, because COVID is not that dangerous in terms of mortality for younger people. But when you hit a certain age, particularly if you have comorbidities, it can be very deadly. So who should get it first? Well, and I wrote about this on National Review if people want to find it. The suggestion from this medical not rationing, but medical triage determination, because it would be a triage, would be the people who get it first would be those who need it the most and that are most at risk. Healthcare workers who are on the front line, that makes sense to me, right? Mm-hmm. You have people going into the hospitals and people working and so forth. They should be at the front of the line as well, because they have to be as healthy as possible to keep the rest of us safer. And also people doing very essential services. And I thought that was a very appropriate triage plan, because when you don't have enough vaccine to cover everybody, you have to decide who gets it first and who gets it later. Emmanuel came around and said, no, what we really need are to give the vaccine to people to make sure they don't have a shortened life. In other words, people who would have longer to live if they they didn't get sick. But the problem with that, so he's talking about giving prevalence to younger people instead of aged people. Mm-hmm. But the younger people are far less at risk. But his view is that, well, what matters is the total number of years that would be saved. So since an elderly person, let's say you save him from COVID, but they die 2 years later, versus, say, a 60-year-old who might not die for 20 or 25 years if you save that person from COVID. But the problem is the 60-year-old is not nearly as much at risk, assuming no comorbidities, as the elderly person. So he is making a quality of life judgment rather than a pure triage, which has to do with survivability and so forth. And so you begin to see where Ezekiel Emanuel is coming from. He is also against medical conscience. That is, he says that if a doctor is asked for an abortion, for example, that doctor should have to perform that abortion as an ethical obligation, or refer to a doctor that doctor knows will perform that abortion. He wrote that up in the New England Journal of Medicine. So you find that people like Ezekiel Emanuel are in control of the dialogue, which is bioethics. Most people don't know what's happening because it happens above popular perspective. That is, the newspapers aren't covering it. The television news shows don't tend to cover it, but they're writing in the professional journals. Back before the COVID, they were having professional symposia, and they were coming up with ideas. And they're very powerful. It's a very powerful group. Just as an example, back in the, we'll say, the 70s and 80s, they began to say, well, somebody who is in a persistent unconscious condition, I don't like to use the term vegetative, because I deny that any human being is a vegetable. None of us are carrots or rutabagas. And of course, a formal diagnostic term is persistent vegetative state, somebody who is thought to be unconscious or minimally conscious. And bioethicists started to say, well, these are people who can live for years and years in this very disabled condition. We should be able to take away their feeding tubes. Well, at the time, people said, well, no one would ever think of doing that. Well, from the top down, eventually you ended up with the Nancy Cruzan case and so forth, and legislation that this group of people are very influential over. And you ended up with all 50 states permitting people like Terry Schiavo to be dehydrated to death over 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. And of course, the big fight was Terry Schiavo. And I was in the heart of that, trying to help save her life and working with her family, doing a lot of writing and so forth. But that was a bioethical agenda item that these unelected experts were able to convince the policymakers should and the medical community generally that is the right thing to do. Take away feeding tubes from people who were in that situation. Certainly if the family doesn't object, and potentially even if the family does object, although that doesn't happen as much. But that's what's coming next, in my opinion.
Well, I don't even know what to say about that. It's so, to me, ghoulish. Who decides what someone's value is? That to me is the most heinous thing about this.
Right. It sets up invidious discrimination. I
Yeah.
mean, basically, it's if you said, for example, that somebody who is African American should be denied food and water, we'd say you're a terrible bigot. But when you say it about somebody like Terry Schiavo, you're not being racist, but you're creating a different victim for the same kind of discrimination.
Hmm.
Particularly when you had a family. People have a right to refuse medical treatment, and feeding tube is considered a medical treatment because there's a minor surgery involved. You would know better than me, and a formula and so forth.
Hmm.
But in the Terry Schiavo case, you had a blood family of brother and sister, Bobby Schindler and Vanessa, and Bob Schindler, the father, and Mary Schindler, the mother, who said, let us take care of her. And you had a husband who was living with another woman and having children with her, saying, no, she wouldn't want to live like this. Well, talk about a conflict of interest. And yet the media and the courts, none of them cared that Michael Schiavo had a conflict of interest a mile wide. I mean, if you're sleeping with a woman, she's having your children, and you can't marry her, do you think there's a problem?
Yeah. For
I
a
mean,
little bit.
yeah, so that whole case was really disheartening because Terry was allowed to just languish for more than a year when appeals were pending, and the family was saying, we have occupational therapists who think they can teach her to swallow again,
Hmm.
and so forth. I mean, we don't know whether she would have been able to be taught to swallow again or not, but the judge wouldn't even let them try. I mean, what was the harm? Why not let them try? And I'll tell you why he wouldn't let them try, because what if they succeeded? Because if they succeeded, you wouldn't have been able to take away her food and water. So this whole Terry Schiavo thing was really a huge tipping point, both in bioethics, I think, in the culture, and in the way people look at people with that kind of very serious cognitive incapacity. And the next victims are going to be people with dementia. You're now having assisted suicide and euthanasia activists talking about allowing people diagnosed with dementia to sign an advance directive to say that when they become incapacitated, don't give them any food and water, meaning dehydrate and starve them to death. And Nevada has actually passed a law that would seem to say that that's legal. And of course, that's just the way to get to the lethal injection, because people will say, oh my gosh, that's a horrible thing to do to anybody. And the answer smoothly and oily will be, why, yes, it is. Let's just give them the lethal injection instead. It's much more humane. No, the answer is you don't cause them to die. But I'm afraid that once people accept the premise, well, there's such a thing as a life not worthy of being lived, that we will move very quickly towards the kind of things you're seeing in Canada, in Netherlands, and Belgium with lethal injection euthanasia, where people with dementia are being killed. Elderly people, or some of them are receiving joint voluntary euthanasia because they're worried about future widowhood. In Belgium and Netherlands, I hope I'm not being too scattershot, but in Belgium and Netherlands, there's no age limit for euthanasia. And in Netherlands in particular, they permit infanticide. That is, if a baby is born with serious disabilities, or a terminal illness, they are lethally injected in their bassinet. So all of this stuff arises from rejecting the equality of life ethic and accepting a quality of life ethic where some people have greater value than others. And then some bioethicists even take it further by saying some animals with a higher cognitive capacity have greater value than people with a lower cognitive capacity. People like Peter Singer of Princeton University, who is not coincidentally the world's foremost proponent of infanticide, is also one of the world's foremost proponents of animal liberation.
So this is, you open the door to one thing, and the whole premise to me is wrong, because any life has value. I don't care who you are, what you look like, where you come from. And to open that door, you just described a floodgate of applying it to whomever you want to get rid of. And, we're talking now, I mean, we have a few minutes before we have to take our break, but I want to open the door to things like the Green New Deal and the Gaia principle where everything is more important than the human being. And so if that's the case,
Yeah. Well, once you deny what I call human exceptionalism, the unique value of human life, once you say human life doesn't have unique value as an objective matter,
mhm,
meaning it comes with the package. And that's, of course, the predicate to universal human rights. Because if you say I don't believe in human exceptionalism, then you have to come up with what are the criteria that make one life have greater value than another life.
mhm,
And some human beings are not going to have the criteria that you establish, and therefore they're going to become dispensable because they're going to be deemed as of lesser value. And we were talking about the quality of life ethic. And then once you go there, you're going to get into some of these more radical environmental issues, such as nature rights, the Gaia theory, animal rights, which is not the same thing as animal welfare. I'm a huge proponent, obviously, of animal welfare. Human beings, human exceptionalism has two aspects. Number one, our unique value, but also as the only known moral species in the universe, we have obligations. We understand right from wrong.
mhm.
And so we have duties, just as one example, to treat animals humanely. That's not the same thing as animal rights. Animal rights is an ideology that says humans and animals have equal value because an animal can feel pain and a human being can feel pain. Therefore, whatever we do to an animal is the same thing as if you did it to a human. And then you end up with people for the ethical treatment of animals saying that if you have a leather couch or a leather purse, it's the same thing as the lampshades made from human skin at Auschwitz. That's how crazy it gets. And you eat your tail and you go a little bit crazy when you
Mhm.
deny human exceptionalism. And the people who end up suffering the most, the people who become victimized by that ideology, are the most weak and vulnerable, the people who can't defend themselves. And that's been, the history of the human race when things have gone wrong, has been when we have created an other with lesser value than ourselves.
Or what we deem to be a lesser value,
Exactly. I mean,
right?
you
So
and
this
I would agree that everyone has equel value,
absolutely.
but what the people with the power to decide deem to have lesser value.
We've seen that, the Tuskegee experiments. We've seen that
Sure.
with
That's a
various.
classic example where African Americans were deemed to have lesser value than white Americans. So we would tell them we were treating them for syphilis when we actually weren't, to see how they died from syphilis. What a horrible, monstrous thing to do. And that was done after World War II and all of the horrors from the concentration camps.
It's like you learn nothing from it except how to, for lack of a way to put it, make it oily, kind of make it nebulous, make it
Yeah.
something that's good for everybody.
And it's
And
the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement said, by definition, was anti-human exceptionalism because it said there's such a thing as the fit and the unfit. And the unfit should be prevented from procreating. And that led to the infamous Supreme Court case 1927, Buck v. Bell, which allowed a daughter of a prostitute who had had a child out of wedlock because she'd been raped by a foster family member and then put in a mental institution to protect the foster family member. Oliver Wendell Holmes said 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, and she was involuntarily sterilized, even though she had done absolutely nothing wrong. And that led to the floodgates of tens of thousands of Americans being involuntarily sterilized up into the 40s. And it was a terrible, cruel, evil approach, and it was supported by the quote experts and the progressive elite of the time.
I think on that note, we need to take our first break because this is something that people need to get their heads around. You're living in the solution. Welcome back to Living the Solution. We're speaking with Mr. Wesley Smith. He's an author and I'd say an advocate for humanity. I think that's the best way to put it. There's a book that I'm really interested in, and I think it's true. Something Brave New World. We're kind of living in that mindset of designer babies, CRISPR, creating the perfect human being, and getting rid of disease. But is it really more about control? That's my question. Because if some group is deciding who wins and who loses, then it makes sense that they'd want to create more of themselves, right? Is that what's going on? And get rid of the rest of us who actually have souls. That's what it sounds like to me.
Well, yeah, we're now getting into the futuristic stuff, transhumanism, genetic engineering through CRISPR, which is a gene editing a technique that actually the inventors just won the Nobel Prize in physics, I believe it was, or might have been medicine. Any organism and any cell can now be genetically altered very quickly and efficiently, and that leads to the potential to get rid of a disease, and it also leads to the potential to turn us into a consumer society, kind of like out of Gattaca.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think everyone should read Brave New World. That came out in 1932, Aldous Huxley, and he really called it. I mean, people talk about 1984 and George Orwell. 1984 is also pretty important, but I think Huxley really nailed it, because the people of Brave New World are basically they've lost their humanity in the sense that everything is about pleasure, and there's no such thing as the sanctity of human life. You're not supposed to feel any kind of unpleasant emotion, so they have the drug called soma, which will keep people on a continual high so they never feel unhappiness. You're not supposed to have any connections. There's promiscuity is the promise, and it is carried out. And you end up with a society that really has no purpose, and other than pleasure. So it's very hedonistic, and that becomes the only purpose. And then the people there, in the novel opens where they're talking about how they don't, children aren't born, they're hatched in a kind of a cloning. It's sort of a cloning before cloning was actually done that he came up with, and they're genetically engineered. So you have the uber class, the upper class, who are engineered to be upper class. Then you have like the omegas, who are the drone workers, but they're also genetically engineered not only to do drone work, but to like doing drone work. And it's really an important novel that I think people should take a look at. And science fiction has been looking at this kind of idea of hyper control, that doing away with the natural, of a hubris that basically says that because I want something, that should be done. You see that a lot in the procreation or the reproductive technologies, where now you have very beautiful women in the elite universities being paid $50,000 for their eggs, so that the eggs can be used in IVF. Well, that's a form of eugenics, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what they don't tell these young women is that getting your eggs extracted and harvested can be a dangerous process, because you have to have a hyperstimulation of ovaries that leads to the release of, say, 20 or 30 eggs in a cycle instead of one or two. What does that do to the body? Well, sometimes it leads to to ovary swelling. It can lead to serious illness. On occasion, women have died from it. It also requires a somewhat invasive surgery of a needle put through the vaginal wall to extract the eggs and so forth. So it's not this tiny little thing, but you're taking you're turning procreation into manufacture, and that comes complete with quality control. So you do pre-implantation diagnosis, where you check the genetic quality of the embryo by taking out, when it's like about 10 cells, you take out a cell and you study it. And if it doesn't meet genetic muster, and of course right now our knowledge of what genes do what are pretty rudimentary, but you toss it out and throw it out as so much medical waste, even though that's a nascent human being. When you create an embryo and that embryo comes into existence, embryology textbooks will tell you that's a human being. It's nascent. It's certainly not a conscious human, not a conscious born person, but it has all of the future potential that every other human being can have. It just needs the proper environment in which to develop. The big stem cell fight was over a lot of this. So you end up seeing that these things have a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's sold as a way of preventing illness or curing illness. Then on the other hand, it soon shifts into more of an enhancement kind of a human engineering improvement approach, because these are dual use technologies. And it does lead to the idea that certain traits are better than other traits, for example, intelligence. And so who do we see wiped off the face of the earth in some countries like Iceland and Denmark? People with Down syndrome.
Yeah.
How many babies with Down syndrome were aborted in this country? What, about 90%? Yet if you want to look at the most loving people you'll ever want to meet, they're people with Down syndrome. Yet they're not the most intelligent. Well, what's more valuable, the ability to love or intelligence? I would say the ability to love. But that's not how we should be dividing people. We should be embracing everyone.
Oh, it pervades the entire society.
Yes, it does. And more so now, I want to have a baby. I'll do anything to have a baby. I hear when I criticize some of these environmental technologies, I'm told I do anything to have a baby. And my response is, I'm sorry, man, but that's the problem. You would do anything to have a baby. And sometimes there are things that shouldn't be done. There are lines that shouldn't be crossed. And this whole area right now is so unregulated. It's like a wild, wild west. And if you try to regulate just IVF, just as an example, try to control, the idea of poor women being hired to be surrogates. They're called gestational carriers, which is a dehumanizing concept that all they are is their uterus. Give me a break. When you try to there's a woman named Jennifer Lahl, Lahl, with the Center for Bioethics and Culture, who has traveled the world trying to get people's attention to that some of these things are incredibly exploitive of women. Taking eggs from poor people or from these students who need the money for the tuition, or hiring the poor women to be uteruses for gestation. And sometimes if the baby isn't what the purchasing parents want, they don't take the baby. I mean, we've seen that on several occasions, particularly in cases overseas. So these are issues that not only deal with our abilities and our incredibly exponentially growing technological capacities, but also the concept of restraint, self-restraint, humility, modesty, that we should think very, very seriously about these avenues we're going down. But when the prime directive in society is me, I, and I get what I want, and I want to have this, and we're told that the only thing that matters is to have pleasure and not the only thing, but that's what we're going to reward, and we're going to increasingly expand and move away from what's natural to give people what they want, without any real significant societal dialogue about what are the limits, if any. Well, we're heading for trouble, I think.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. But it seems that they are cultivating a society to dovetail with the top-down communitarian, everybody. Well, some people are obviously more equal than others, but there's two different classes. There's no middle anymore. It's either those who run it and those who just
and the dependents
exactly get a sustainable income, be in a dark hole and like it.
It's the I call it Blade Runner world. And if you remember the novel and the movie Blade Runner, you have very, very wealthy people behind high walls who are tinkering with genetics and really having an amazing life, and then everybody else lives in semi-social anarchy.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that the world depicted in the movie Blade Runner was really remarkable. And when you consider that I think it was produced in the 80s or 90s, and the Blade Runner world was 2019, as I recall. And we already see some of, the power of Google and the power of, they know our data, they know our advertising. So if you do a search on the internet, I think I told you off air, my wife and I are kind of redoing our kitchen, and I did a search for hood vents, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now every time I turn on the internet, I'm being deluged with hood vent advertisements. I mean, that's a relatively harmless aspect of this, but we're getting to the place where there's the potential for tyranny is remarkable. And I want to turn very quickly to China, just to give you an example how China is using some of these technologies. China has become what I consider the Fourth Reich. With Falun Gong, which is a metaphysical practice They actually arrest Falun Gong members and harvest their organs and sell them on the black market. That's not something that's a paranoid fantasy. It has been demonstrated in a couple of very respected international studies. The Uyghurs, which are Muslims in the west of China, are being herded into concentration camps, and they're used for forced labor. The Uyghur women are subjected to involuntary sterilization and forced abortion. Their children are taken away from them for re-education and so forth. And some Uyghurs are sent around the country to be used in factories that are actually benefiting the bottom line of some very major American companies. Then perhaps eventually most pernicious of all will be the social credit system, where with facial recognition technologies, artificial intelligence, algorithms, and so forth, every person in China will be recognizable to the technology. And if, let's say, you're a Christian, this is really aimed at Christians, and you go to church, well, you get demerits. And if you are seen talking to somebody who has a low social credit score, well, you get demerits. And eventually, if you get too many demerits, if you are deemed to be antisocial, meaning you don't follow what the Communist Party wants without hesitation and without question, then you can eventually perhaps lose the apartment you have, the right to receive medical care, even the right to go on a train or a bus. And P.S., your children could lose the right too. So let's say you're a Christian and the government comes and says, reject Christ. You say, no, I'm not going to reject Christ. Well, that has a 2,000-year pedigree, right?
Mm-hmm.
And people will, as we know, the martyrs of Christian martyrs would and have for millennia. Some have actually made that very difficult choice and chosen death over rejection of Christ. But what's insidious about this is they won't say, you reject Christ or we'll kill you. They'll say, you better reject Christ or your child's not going to be able to go to school. Your child's not going to be able to get a job. Your child's not going to be able to get on the bus. Your child's not going to be able to have a family and get married because no respectable Chinese family is going to want to have somebody who's been socially excommunicated. And that's the kind of world that China is beginning to create. We're seeing some of that same thing happen in the United States with cancel culture, where if you said the wrong thing about the wrong group of people, you get fired, or your Facebook or your Twitter is canceled, or you're unable to get a job because somebody's looked into your Facebook history, your social media history, and you might have said something 5 years ago that today is deemed to be bigoted, even though at the time it was normal. And so we have a very serious circumstance now where the a technocracy is coming into being, where you have a class of experts, and then you have a culture in which a lot of people, I'm a baby boomer. When I was young, we said question authority. I'm afraid that many in today's youth say obey authority, and the authority is a cultural authority. What does the culture demand? And that leads to less freedom. And I'll tell you what I'm very concerned about is the Chinese I was in China in 2016, and it was a remarkable experience because they had done away with formal communism and allowed a lot of consumerism and some free enterprise, and there was a great deal of prosperity quite evident in the country, but there was no political freedom at all. And the bargain that the Chinese seems to have made, the bet they made, the Chinese leaders with their people, was that if we give people prosperity, they won't care about political freedom. And then they will be, as long as they have security, they will do what they're told. The bet in the West has always been that economic freedom and prosperity leads to political freedom and prosperity. But we see less freedom in the United States today and much less freedom in China today. And I'm beginning to worry that China might actually have the winning hand when it comes to these technologies. China has already engaged in genetic engineering of 2 babies,
Mm-hmm.
as you know, and that the researcher was put in jail for that. But you can't tell me the Chinese government didn't know what was going on. That was a communist country. You have communist overlords in all the labs. They knew what was going on. They just were upset that people reacted negatively. And so he got scapegoated. But I'm sure he'll be back because they put a lot of money and effort into training him. So I guess I'm being a little scattershot here, but
I
this
think
all does flow from rejecting human exceptionalism.
I think what you're saying is extremely important, and we're living the opposite thing right now. You just described giving people prosperity for their allegiance.
Right.
We're trying to take away freedom of speech, freedom of religion. We have that for fear. It's not because we're going to get a better life. It's all based on fear. So I hope that people will stop, trying to transfer. If I just go along and get along, it'll all be okay. I think the COVID situation has opened or answered that question for me, because those people in the lockdown states have done everything they've been asked to do and then some, and they want to do it more and
Right.
longer. There's no reward.
And
I mean,
even in Europe, it's been even more draconian, and yet their numbers are spiking. We're in the middle of a pandemic. You just have to keep going forward. Um, uh, Dr. Fauci, I found an article he wrote in Cell, which is a science journal and generally deals with things like stem cells and various scientific things. But he co-authored this piece, and I was on Laura Ingraham about this particular article, and I wrote about it in the Epoch Times, where Dr. Fauci said that he believes that we are entering an era of pandemics, and that as a consequence of that, not because of COVID, but because of others that could be coming after COVID, he said we need to remake the entirety of human infrastructure at the international level. We need to strengthen the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and so forth, and remake everything about human society. Well, that is using the fear of disease as a means of obtaining total control over a society. And I don't know if I don't think Dr. Fauci is a Nazi or anything, but when you have the hubris to say we have to remake the entirety of human infrastructure, how we travel, how we interact with each other, how our cities are built, how we work, because of fear of disease, that means you're going to have a technocracy with teeth that will make the idea of mask mandates, which I don't get too involved in, but that's going to be nothing. You're going to be talking about vaccine mandates. You're going to be talking about all kinds of other approaches to living that will do away with individual rights. I mean, you can't forcibly remake human infrastructure, as Dr. Fauci advocated in this very clearly in this article in Cell. And if people want to find the article, if they go to some of my writing, I link to it, without having a kind of society that is not what the United States was founded to be. It will become a collectivist, technocratic, authoritarian, probably soft authoritarian, I mean, not lining people up against the wall and shooting them and so forth, but a soft authoritarian kind of thing. And if you don't go along, you will be deemed somebody who could make people sick. I mean, you've seen the howling and screaming that people have experienced just from walking into a store without a mask.
Exactly. But you know what? I would be a little bit more dubious about that. I think that there are people who would want to hurt you because of the perception that you don't care about humanity and therefore they have the right to do that. We see this every day with these riots and people being assaulted just because of their beliefs culturally, from their religion, from their political standpoint. This is not live and let live. This is hurt you culture.
This is French Revolution stuff, is what it is.
Kind of is. And
yeah.
I think, how do we pull ourselves back from this? I think that we can't live in fear.
Right.
We have science. This is not science that we're listening to. This is fear mongering and pulling the football every time we get to a point that they said we're supposed to get to. Initially, it was just 2 weeks to flatten the curve, has turned into 6 months of live in your house. I mean, and it's still not working, right? So if people can just critically think and said, this isn't working, we're not doing it. Enough people said that. Would that make a difference?
Well, I think people have to be responsible and engage in reasonable public health measures. I think obviously some of the, social distancing works, washing your hands, being careful. But we have to understand this is not smallpox. This is COVID that really is only terribly serious for a small segment of the population, and we need to protect those people, and we need to protect them carefully. One of the horrors that occurred in this was when Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, forced infected people into nursing home.
Well, there was 5 governors that did it.
Yeah, and the massive New Jersey and a few others. Yeah.
Michigan, and it was 40% of the deaths. So that should be an indication that public policy has to be within reason. That's the dumbest
right.
thing ever. You take the weakest and most infirm and put them together with people who are sick. Yeah. What do you think was going to happen?
Of course. And what I'm hoping is we'll remember who we are as Americans. That isn't, you don't be foolhardy, but you go about your life. I'm a baby boomer. I'm in a higher risk category. I'm more careful. I've stopped doing a few things that I used to do. That's my choice. And it's my responsibility. It's not the responsibility of the society to shut down to protect me. It is my responsibility to live, and I'm not living like a hermit. I'm careful. And that's my job. It's not the job of my nieces or nephews who are young and trying to make their way in the world to have to be locked in their homes for 2 years until a vaccine comes along to protect me, because that would be wrong. That would be stealing from the seed corn. And I read a book called The Splendid and the Vile, which is about Churchill's first year in office in 1940 during the Blitz. The London and other Brits and other cities that were just having hundreds of bombers flying over them every night, bombing the heck out of the cities. The next day they'd come up out of the underground, they'd come out of their homes, and they'd go to work. And I'm thinking, what happened to that spirit? That was much worse than we're experiencing. My father, who was in the midst of World War II, went to New Guinea and had horrendous experiences. Have we lost that ability, that kind of courage as a people that we've had in our entire a life as a country? I certainly hope not.
Well, I don't think we have, and maybe now we're at such a point that people, and maybe this election, for whatever, if you want to put it, it could be a good thing, that there's now a choice. I mean, either you want to go back and live your life with reason, right? Or you can double down on what we've been experiencing for 6 months. And no one talks about the human cost, psychological, people killing themselves.
25% of youth, according to I forgot the name of the study, but 25% had suicidal thoughts as a consequence of these of the shutting down of the society. Well, that's a catastrophe.
Again, it comes down to the individual then, doesn't it? If we don't believe in our humanity and our worth, the fact that we're all precious, if we all felt that way, I don't think that they could do this to us. Do you?
No, and we have to act not with anger, but with courage, and decide for ourselves in terms of the COVID, how we're going to go about living our lives and take care of each other. And we have to reject policies that create invidious distinctions that say that some people have greater value than others based on a quality of life, because eventually none of us, all of us, if we live long enough, are going to end up in a situation where we are disabled or we're elderly and frail and so forth. And you don't want to have people being cast aside over that. No. Everybody deserves an equal place. Human exceptionalism says each and every one of us has equal moral value simply and merely because we are human. That's the only thing that is required for us to have equal moral worth. We don't have to earn it by having a certain intelligence or a certain physical capacity or a certain level of health or a certain level of ability. It comes because we're human. And that's the only way, accepting that premise as the bottom line. And then having a bioethics, getting back to what we started discussing at first, that is predicated on policies that promote and support human exceptionalism, then you're going to be able to have a bioethics and deal with the difficulties of high-tech medicine and people who are, having a very difficult time in terms of physical illness or health in a way that is moral and decent and embracing and accepting, and not one that abandons and rejects and calls it compassion.
I think you just described exactly where we need to be. It's about abundance, and there's more than enough. It's not about lack. That's what they deal in. What's the best way that people can read your writings?
Yeah, I write it I'm in the National Review, I'm in Epoch Times, I'm in American Spectator, I'm in First Things. If people want to go to the Discovery Institute, that's discovery.org, and look up Human Exceptionalism, you'll find my articles archive. I'm also on Twitter, the Wesley J. Smith, and I'm also on Facebook. I post all my articles on Twitter and on Facebook. If you go to National Review, do a lot of blogging there on the corner. You'll find my articles. Same with Epoch Times, American Spectator, and I used to write a lot for the Washington Examiner website.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed it. It was a great conversation.
Oh, thank you, Elaine. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, everybody, for living in the solution.
Revolutionary Talk for Revolutionary Times. Liberty Talk FM.